Chapter 11, Genesis chapters 36 through 50. Israel is saved. We have come a long way in Genesis, from Adam to Seth to Noah to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the main line of descent the writer is tracing out. But along the way, we have also met the displaced elder sons, Cain, Ishmael, and Esau. The writer doesn't want us to forget about them. He even used up one of his "These are the descendants of" sections to make sure we didn't forget about Ishmael in chapter 25, verses 12 through 18, a 7-verse reminder before we move on to the story of Jacob and Esau. Genesis chapter 36 is similar. The 9th, "These are the descendants of" section, and an entire chapter dedicated to Esau's line before we move on to the next episode in the main story. We have seen throughout Genesis how these stories are written in light of Israel's later experiences, as late as the exile to Babylon and the return. As we saw back in chapter 1 of this book, the list of Edomite kings in Genesis chapter 36, verses 31 through 40 is another example. The list is introduced in verse 31. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom. Before any king reigned over the Israelites. This statement makes no sense unless the writer lived in a time when Israel's kings were currently ruling or had ruled at some point in the past. This would have been no earlier than about 1000 BCE, if not later in exilic times. Genesis looks back over the centuries to talk about the days of old. We might be beating a dead horse, but getting on board with this idea is central to reading Genesis through ancient eyes, that is, through the eyes of those who wrote the story as we have it today. Genesis chapter 37 brings us to the 10th and final "These are the descendants of" section. This one is dedicated to the line of Jacob through his favorite son, Joseph, firstborn of his favorite wife, Rachel. See Genesis chapter 37, verse 2. Unfortunately, the NRSV has the phrase as "this is a story of the family of Jacob," but it is the same phrase we find in the other section dividers. Joseph will play a vital role in the survival of his people, and we may know it as one of the better-known stories in the Bible, inspirer of children's coloring books and Broadway musicals alike. Donny Osmond in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, anyone? But this story is really about what happens to the line of Jacob, now Israel. Genesis is the story of the beginning of Israel. An annoying younger brother lands on his feet. Joseph, like every other character we've encountered so far, starts off with some pretty serious flaws, but still turns out to be a key figure in God's plan. At the outset, Joseph is a boot-licking daddy's boy. Israel even gave Joseph this beautiful robe, which he wore around his brothers, flaunting his favorite status. The 17-year-old even tattles on his brothers. We hope the Genesis theme of sibling rivalry is ringing loud and true in your ears at this point. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, now Joseph and his brothers. What gives? Israel's national history will be one big sibling rivalry event. The 12 brothers will, in time, become the 12 tribes of Israel, and they will, wait for it, not get along at all. The kingdom of Israel, unified under David and Solomon, will quickly split into 2 kingdoms, 10 tribes making up the north, and the remaining 2, Judah and Benjamin, making up the south. Sibling rivalry is a civil war in miniature. So, Joseph's brothers hate him, not just because of the snappy clothes, but because Joseph rubs it in their faces. Joseph has 2 dreams with the same message. He will one day rule over his brothers. Having the dreams is one thing, but Joseph makes sure his brothers know about them. Do you think they're going to welcome this news with open arms? We didn't think so. It's 10 angry brothers against one cocky, spoiled teenager. One day, they see him coming from a distance and say, "Here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him." But, after some debate, Cooler heads prevail, and they take his robe and throw him into a well. When a caravan of Ishmaelite or Arabic traders passes on the way to Egypt, the brothers sell Joseph to them. They get some quick cash and they rid themselves of the problem. It's a win-win. To cover up their crime, they dip the coveted robe in goat's blood and tell their father that his favorite son has been ripped apart by wild animals. Here we go again. Yet another brotherly incident that involves blood. Think Abel. And deception. Think Jacob. And again, Jacob, the great deceiver, gets another dose of his own medicine. He falls for the ruse. Jacob is devastated. His favorite son from his favorite wife is dead. Little does he know that Joseph is making his way to Egypt to be sold as a slave to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's high-ranking officials. Joseph quickly becomes a trusted man in Potiphar's court. He is put in charge of Potiphar's house, and we see the promise to Abraham at work again. God blesses Potiphar because Potiphar blesses Joseph. In chapter 39, verse 5, Potiphar trusts him completely. Too bad Joseph is a total stud, and Potiphar's wife has a thing for him. One day, while they are alone in the house, she tries to seduce him, but Joseph refuses. Unfortunately, she has a good hold of his tunic, and so when Joseph tries to get out of there, he leaves without his clothes. This is the second time he has lost his clothing. Remember the Technicolor robe? With tragic results. Immediately, the scorned and guilty woman lies to the household servants and to Potiphar, telling them that it was Joseph who tried to seduce her. Another deception. Who is Potiphar going to believe? He throws Joseph in jail, just like his brothers threw him in the pit. The guy can't catch a break. Or can he? We've already learned that Joseph has coded dreams. In those days, the ability to interpret dreams was a valuable art. And it just so happens that while Joseph is in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, already incarcerated, each have a dream that they simply can't make heads or tails of. Joseph interprets the cupbearer's dream. He will be released from prison and restored to Pharaoh's good graces. Joseph then interprets the baker's dream, which is less promising. He will have his head chopped off and stuck on a pole for bird food. Both dreams come true, and Joseph asks the cupbearer to put in a good word for him with Pharaoh. And in line with Joseph's bad luck, the cupbearer forgets. That is, until Pharaoh starts having some dreams of his own that need interpreting. Joseph's dream comes true. Since we live in a world of, I know what you did last summer, The Walking Dead, and no fewer than 7 Saw movies, we might not be that creeped out by dreams of skinny cows eating fat cows, or, if you can picture it, skinny stalks of wheat eating fat stalks of wheat. But to Pharaoh, these dreams are disturbing. His own magicians cannot tell him what the dreams mean, and that is their job. So the cupbearer says, "Hey, I remember. I was in prison with this Hebrew guy who is quite good at interpreting dreams." Pharaoh calls for Joseph. "I hear you can interpret dreams," says Pharaoh. "Actually," Joseph replies, "God interprets dreams. I am just the messenger." Joseph has learned some humility while staring at his prison walls. Pharaoh relays his dreams, nightmares really, about scrawny cows, wheat stalks eating fat cows, wheat stalks to Joseph, and Joseph immediately knows what they mean. Egypt will have 7 years of abundance, fat cows and wheat stalks, followed by 7 years of famine, scrawny cows, wheat stalks. And the famine will be much worse than the abundant years. So Pharaoh takes a chance and asks the prisoner Joseph what he thinks they should do about it. Joseph says to store up food during the 7 years of abundance so that they will have enough to ration out during the years of famine. Good call, Joseph. So, Joseph, a Hebrew prisoner, saves Egypt from destruction. Several generations later, these same Egyptians would turn on the Hebrews and enslave them. Bad form, Egypt. But that's a story for another book, namely Exodus. While Joseph is promoted from slave to Pharaoh's right hand man in charge of preparing for the famine, Jacob and his growing family are still back in the land of Canaan. The famine hits, and Jacob starts to feel the pinch. He sends his remaining sons, except for Benjamin, his youngest and the only other son of his favorite wife, Rachel, to Egypt to see if they can buy some grain from Pharaoh. And please tell me if you've seen this go to Egypt because of a famine idea before. This episode, which sets up the end of Genesis that leads to Israel's enslavement in Egypt, mirrors Abraham's trek to Egypt back in Genesis chapter 12. And just like in that earlier story, where Sarah is a guest in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers will soon find themselves in their own awkward situation in Pharaoh's house. That same scene comes up again big time in the book of Exodus, where this story is headed, when the Israelites are slaves to Pharaoh. Joseph's brothers come to Egypt, and wouldn't you know it? They must meet with Joseph, who is now the one in charge of rationing the food. He recognizes them immediately, but they don't recognize him. Instead, they bow down to him, fulfilling the dream he had as a boy. The story could have come to a quick end here, but the writer has more to say. Payback is not the point. There is a deeper lesson his readers need to learn. God delivers Israel. The brothers are completely vulnerable, but instead of revealing who he is, Joseph plays a little trick on them. He accuses them of spying. He strikes a deal. Show me you are honest men by bringing back this youngest brother of yours you say you have. They are less than excited about this deal, since they know Jacob will not want to risk it. He's a little gun-shy about having his favorite remaining child after losing Joseph. But, having no real choice, they leave another brother, Simeon, as collateral. He is bound in chains, and the remaining brothers make their way back to Canaan with a heavy message to deliver. The brothers deserve every bit of this. They have to deliver another piece of bad news to their father about another one of Rachel's sons, only this time it is the truth. They have been pondering this bit of poetic justice on the long journey home. Jacob refuses, and we can't blame him. Joseph is lost, and Simeon is as good as lost. He will not lose another son. The thing is, though, the famine does not subside, and they soon run out of the grain they bought on the first trip. Jacob's hand is forced. Rather than lose all of his family to the famine, he relents out of desperation and sends the sons back with a lot of gifts in hopes of making sure he gets his Benjamin back. They stay for a while in Egypt and are treated very well. And Benjamin, far from being in harm's way, is given 5 times as much to eat and drink as anyone else. But it's all a setup. Joseph isn't going to let them off that easily. The brothers leave, greatly relieved with all the grain they can carry. What they don't know is that the trickster Joseph has planted his silver cup in Benjamin's bag and is about to accuse them of stealing it. Joseph's men ride after them, catch up with them, and promptly arrest them for stealing the cup, a scene that echoes Jacob and Rachel's flight from Laban, a slightly revised version of the stolen idol incident. The brothers plead innocence, but it is announced that the one who has the cup will be returned to Egypt as a slave. Joseph is reenacting his own story with the other favorite son, while his brothers helplessly watch. After the cup is found, they all return to Joseph to beg for his mercy. To return without Benjamin might literally kill their aging father. Fortunately for his brothers, Joseph feels he has punished them enough. His heart is breaking, and he reveals his identity to his brothers, who simply can't believe what they are seeing. And, in a statement of not only forgiveness, but spiritual maturity, he tells his brothers that this was God's plan all along. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. In chapter 45, verses 7 and 8. Change a few words, and the Israelites could be saying the same thing after the Exodus, and especially after the return from Babylonian exile. God preserved us, a remnant, and delivered us from harm. And if you do a word search for remnant in the books of Ezra, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, you can see how closely that idea is tied to Israel's return from exile. With great joy, Joseph sends his brothers back, and Pharaoh himself invites Joseph's entire family to join him in Egypt. He even gives them the land of Goshen, the best of the land on the outskirts of Egypt. The brothers arrive back in Canaan and give Jacob the news. He is stunned and overjoyed. All of the people of Israel migrate to Egypt, and this is where they remain as we end the story of Genesis. And they do quite well for themselves. They prosper, and more importantly, they are fruitful and increase greatly in number. Genesis chapter 47, verse 27. After all we have seen of these Israelites, one misstep after another, God is still with them, blessing them and increasing their number, in keeping with the ancient command of creation in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. As Genesis comes to a close, we see Jacob growing very old and near death. And in his last act as patriarch, he blesses each of his sons and grandsons, beginning with Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, Genesis chapter 48. He insists, though, on blessing Ephraim the younger over Manasseh the elder. Here we go again, the preference of the younger brother over the elder. This scene is more than an extended goodbye. It is a glimpse of Israel's future. Ephraim will be one of the names of the powerful northern kingdom of Israel, after the monarchy divides into north and south after the reign of Solomon. In Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 12, Jacob blesses his son Judah over all his brothers. Judah will be the name of the southern kingdom. Judah receives an especially exalted place in Jacob's blessing, for all Israel's hopes will be pinned on the king of Judah. This king's name will be David. The blessings given to Ephraim and Judah in Genesis signal the political prominence of these tribes in Israel's future. The book ends with the death of Jacob and then Joseph. With this, Israel's infancy comes to an end, and a difficult period of growth is about to begin. The transition from a people to a nation is not one that will come easily. It will end with Israel licking its wounds from Babylonian captivity. And as we have seen it, that larger story is already in view throughout Genesis. Israel's ancient story is one of struggle with God and with others. It is also a story of Israel's faith in God, that God will come through for them no matter what. Genesis is Israel's story to show that God can be counted on from the very beginning. Conclusion. Now what? The book of Genesis just sort of stops cold, doesn't it? No nice conclusion to wrap things up. If you're feeling that Genesis leaves you hanging, you're not wrong. You're picking up on the role Genesis plays in the story of Israel. It's just the beginning. It's not meant to draw loose ends together and give us a resolution. It's meant to tease us into reading how the story of this large and getting larger by the minute family will pan out as they continue to struggle with God, with highs and lows, peaks and valleys. That story will eventually find Israel in exile in Babylon, that great national tragedy that fuels their vision for writing their grand story, what we call the Old Testament. We know we didn't cover everything. We warned you about that at the beginning. There were some episodes we only glanced at, and others we just couldn't get to at all. We kept our focus on reading Genesis as an ancient story. That means trying, as best we can, to lay aside what we as modern Christians think Genesis is saying or ought to be saying, and pay closer attention to what the ancient author was actually saying to his ancient readers. We simply intended to put you on the right road, point you in the right direction, and give you a big push. Happy travels. We also didn't get into some of those sexy issues that drive people into endless Facebook debates. Things like evolution, the Big Bang Theory, and whether dinosaurs were on the ark. To be honest, we hope that as you learn to read Genesis as an ancient story, you will discover that Genesis wasn't set up to answer those sorts of questions. Genesis was written to answer ancient questions for ancient Israelites. Whatever you think Genesis means for us today, you need to start by understanding what Genesis meant for them back then. Now it's up to you. 1. Reread Genesis, filling out some of the details we weren't able to cover and discovering the ancient story for yourself. And 2. Keep going, reading the story in Exodus and beyond, always with ancient eyes. If you are interested in learning more about reading Genesis with ancient eyes, we have included some reading suggestions that go into a little more detail. But again, even these are only scratching the surface. Reading Genesis and all of Scripture is a lifelong process of learning, adjustment, and refinement. Welcome to the journey.